Hi there, it's Jeff here with a global economics video. Let's take a look at two countries, United States and South Korea, two nations that have very different trade ratios. So take a look at this chart, which shows US exports of goods and services as a share of their annual GDP, all the way back to 1990 through to 2023. And you can see that despite the ups and downs, essentially the United States exports around 10 to 11% of their GDP, which is a pretty low figure. They import, by the way, much more. So why does the United States only export around 1/10 of their annual national output and national income? Well, one reason, of course, is the size of the domestic market is so huge. Their internal market is so vast that it can absorb a huge amount of domestic production. You have the likes of Walmart and Amazon producing, supplying at scale. They don't necessarily need to export to achieve high revenues and profits. So that tends to reduce the reliance on exports as a growth engine. And indeed, many US firms focus on domestic consumers because it's sufficient to sustain their profitability and meet the demands of shareholders. Second argument is about natural resource abundance. The United States does have huge natural resources, energy independence. So instead of importing vast amounts of oil and gas, it now produces much of what it needs domestically. The role of the US dollar is quite important. The US dollar is basically a reserve currency. You can buy more or less anything you want in the world with a dollar. That basically allows the United States to finance their consumption and their imports through financial capital inflows rather than having to export goods and services to balance their overall balance of payments. And something to do with the complexity of the economy. The United States has a highly complex economic infrastructure and ecosystem. A high percentage of their GDP comes from high-value services, intellectual property or IP, and advanced manufacturing. And these sectors don't always add a lot to export percentages because their scale and integration within multinational firms that actually manufacture overseas. For example, US firms based in Ireland do exports to the European Union. Despite the fact that the United States exports only around 11% of GDP, it's still the world's second biggest exporter, at least using the data here from 2023. China, of course, has now far outpaced and surpassed the United States. Germany and the Netherlands come in third and fourth. The Dutch, obviously, there's a big impact there of the Rotterdam port. Japan, Italy, France, South Korea. The UK now comes outside the top 10 in terms of export countries, just behind Mexico. And as we noted, the United States exports about 10% of GDP. It imports far more. This is the annual trade deficit for the US, and that trade balance in billions of dollars has been getting worse, nearly $950 billion in 2022. Now contrast the United States, where exports are around 10% of GDP, with South Korea. Again, there has been a bit of a fall since 2012, but the figure is at or above 45% of GDP. So their exports of goods and services account for nearly or just under half of their national output. South Korea has an export-oriented growth model. And for nearly 60 years now, South Korea has pushed to an export-led industrialization strategy, specializing in highly valuable exportable goods, semiconductors, smartphones, ships, cars. Samsung, of course, is the poster child for a lot of this. It's one of the world's largest producers of semiconductors, which is a cornerstone of global technology supply chains. Allied to this, South Korea has actively pursued trade agreements to ensure market access for its goods and services. So it's got free trade agreements with the United States, with the EU, with China, with ASEAN. And this has basically helped to integrate South Korea deeply into the world economic system. However, a high export to GDP ratio, whilst it injects extra spending and income and jobs into the South Korean economy, also makes South Korea more vulnerable to global economic shocks, things like trade tensions and pandemics and supply chain disruptions. So there we go. It's quite interesting to look at the gap, the difference between the United States and South Korea. One has a huge domestic market, only exports 10% of GDP. South Korea, an export-dominated economy, over 40% of their national output is exported. Thanks for joining in. Take care and see you soon.